We're here today with Kevin Kelly, who's retired general manager of Imperial Irrigation District. This is November the 22nd, 2019, and we're at IID's headquarters. My name is Jay Malinowski, and this is part of the Colorado River Board Oral History Project. So, Kevin, thank you for joining us today. You've been retired, I think, for a couple of years. You can correct that when we get there. But let's talk a little bit about before we get into anything terribly substantive, let's talk about your background here in the Valley and how you ultimately became GM at a very, very large agricultural water district.
Well, first, it's good to see you again, Jay, after all these years. I'm glad that they have you doing this because I might actually want to watch it afterward. But, I followed a very unlikely career path to IID. I'm from the Imperial Valley. My parents still live in Brawley. My wife's from Brawley. We both live in El Centro. I was a journalist, and I sort of dabbled in local politics because I lived here. And I was fascinated by water, mainly as a citizen. But that grew over time because the issue became so, pervasive in this valley, simply because it has such a large water right. So as the subject of water transfers bubbled up, I was in the thick of all that. And I did some contract work for IID during those years, but in 2006 I was brought here as basically a press relations person. After all those years of sort of hanging around IID, and I came in. I worked for the then general manager Charlie Hoskin. He had a split with the IID board, which can happen, and then Brian Brady came in. He was here for about 3 years. Something similar happened there, along with a sort of regime change at the board level, and I found myself as the general manager. I had been the assistant to the general manager. I'd done a lot of work with the board. And I had done some work with volunteer associations and boards before at the El Centro Chamber of Commerce. So I had a very sort of circuitous path to IID, and in 2011 I became GM.
As a journalist, did you cover IID as an ongoing story?
I did some bylined, just straight up journalism early on, but I ended up being the opinion page editor at the local newspaper just before coming to IID, and that was for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was a part of their editorial board because they'd acquired a trade publication that I co-owned.
We're talking about the IV Press?
Yes. Yeah, that title no longer is published. But at the time, the newspaper was sort of consolidating other print vehicles here, and the magazine I did was one of them. So that was how I sort of matriculated back to the newspaper. After originally starting there right out of college, I went to the Ivy Press in 1985.
Wow. Since you grew up in the Valley, and long before you joined the district, did you have any thoughts about IID? I mean, IID's been around a long time. And as I think you would describe it as a driving force in the community.
I did. I had that sense that I think everyone does, that IID was this sort of unifying force. It was kind of a faceless utility when I was just a boy, but I soon learned that it stood for something more than that. We live in a desert. Every summer, people are reminded of just how important water is at a very sort of visceral level, right? Because it can be so extraordinarily hot that you could die. So water ends up being top of mind all summer long. I think at a gut level in this valley.
We're going to get into transfers in San Diego and all that kind of stuff, but since you mentioned summer and water and high temperatures and death, IID was one of the originators of a canal safety program, was it not? Can you talk about that for just 1 minute?
It was, and to this day, the IID Dippy Duck program remains, a favorite of school children. And it has the advantage of also scaring them from going into canals. And as you know, no shortage of open waterways in this valley. And when I was younger, that was a big, big problem. Kids finding their way into canals and drowning. So IID had a very sort of groundbreaking outreach program to grade school level kids when I was growing up. That would have been the baby boom, right? And it continues to this day, and you don't hear about children drowning in canals. I mean, it happens, but you don't hear about it the way you did.
Yeah, and I think your IID's program has been copied over and over again.
I'm sure it has.
With other agencies.
Sure it has. I knew the man who originated that. At least he claimed to have originated. I've since met several other men who claimed to have originated. But his name was Alex Gay, and he also was a Ivy Press alumnus.
Really? Well, there's an old saying that success has many.
Well, that's true. It's true. I found that to be true.
Okay. So you come to IID, and what was on the forefront of the district's menu, if you will, when you joined the district?
Well, as I just said to you off camera, I'm in the process of writing a book about this, and I don't want to give up anything that I hope to publish. But I will say that I came to IID in June of 2006 as a contract employee. And I think I arrived the day after the primary election in which the board changed. And that was my introduction to IID was, and it was no surprise, this is a 5-person elected board, and every 2 years, people fight like hell over if it's a contested race, and it almost always is. So I sort of filled a void at the board level that a past friend of mine and yours, I think, used to fill, Ron Hull. And I would sort of liaison with the board and the general manager, and we tried to move ahead with initiatives at a very sort of tough time, because just the future of water transfers were very much in question. I think if you had put it to a referendum, a popular vote at the time, it would have been soundly defeated. And that in itself, just the QSA, I mean, that ended up causing a seismic change in a 5-person board.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Why the quantification settlement agreement caused such a seismic change with your board?
Well, so as so often happens, IID, with this very large and secure water right, it ends up being sort of caught in the middle between tectonic forces in water, urban water users. And I think that many years ago, probably several decades ago, IID made the calculus that it was better off to be, sort of engaged with the Colorado River community than to be encircled by it. And I think that was probably the right call, because if you just went to the mat and said, hey, this is our water, whoever it belongs to, but it stays here and we're not in the transfer business. I don't think that would be, a tenable position for IID or the, less than 200,000 people who live in this valley long term. So I think you look into the future and you say, well, it's probably better to take on an urban partner and pay for some of these improvements that can only inure to our benefit in terms of protecting our water rights going forward.
But you had farmers that solidly did not agree with that.
Yeah, there's a long tradition in this valley of sort of reflexively opposing anything that would impinge on local water rights. And I think that was the hill that board in 2003 really had to overcome, right? There had already been a transfer between Metropolitan Water District and IID from a decade earlier. But that was for a smaller amount, and it was primarily system improvements, and it didn't rely on fallowing the way the first 15 years of this QSA transfer.
You're talking about metering, canal lining.
Yeah, turnouts, efficiency improvements.
After the MWD transfer that you referenced, IID became, I'll use the word partner for lack of a better word. There probably is a better word. But they engaged with San Diego County Water Authority. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean,
Yeah.
Given that history between the Water Authority, between Metropolitan Water District and IID, that's an interesting triangle.
It is, and it, as you remember, IID was in that sort of in-between place, I mean, literally, where, it's buffeted in all directions. So you got Phoenix metro area to the east, you got greater Los Angeles, and then this pocket called San Diego that sort of conscientious objector, right? But IID is there's no escaping IID being the fulcrum, because they all want it to be, because that's where the water is. So IID did go into a transfer agreement with not just San Diego County Water Authority, but also our neighbors in Coachella. And that deal was signed in 2003. It led to a decade of litigation, all kinds of fractured relationships in this valley, which is still true today. And we're no closer, I think, to answering that burning question of what's going to happen to the Salton Sea.
And the Salton Sea is something that we need to chat about as well. But let me go back, because you mentioned something that is outside my wheelhouse, and that is Phoenix. How do they play into this? I'm sorry, I'm totally unaware.
No, I'm actually sort of this is a new feature of my understanding of the sort of geopolitics of the Colorado River. Phoenix metro area, I think, emerged in this latest drought contingency plan process as a sort of top consideration in having a DCP for the lower basin. I can recall in some of the early run-up to a DCP, which I was a part of as a principal for IID. And as you know, IID is not part of the DCP. But my recollection is that one of the big motivations for the federal government was to get a drought contingency plan in place so that there was more predictability and confidence for the water users in Phoenix and Arizona generally, but especially Phoenix.
So this hinges then on Arizona's entitlement to Colorado River water and how they gave up some first rights to MWD, particularly when the CAP was built. I mean, how's that for a house?
No, that really is it. So you actually know that from MWD, but there's this whole sort of I don't know. Lingering agitation over Arizona versus California and the creation of CAP and what people I know in Arizona believe turned out to be, a Pyrrhic victory for the state of Arizona.
As it's turned out.
Exactly.
But how does IID factor into that?
Well, so I guess the sort of default answer to how does IID figure in to anything on the Colorado River is that that's where the water is. And so we end up being part of a conversation whether we're in the room or not.
That's an excellent description, and primarily because of your entitlement. Well, let's talk a little bit then about the San Diego transfer. How did that go?
Yeah, so I actually I was doing some work for IID back then, but not sort of sporadic. But I was around the whole arc of that storyline. I was directly involved in it. And my recollection is that some people came in from the outside and they bought up a whole bunch of land in the Imperial Valley. I think they may have shopped it to Metropolitan first.
You're talking about private
and
entrepreneurs.
The Bass brothers.
Right.
They bought about 42,000 acres that IID ended up acquiring after, about almost a decade, I think. But those Texas billionaires had 42,000 acres of land, and I think they must have said, well, this is just a big Palo Verde Valley. We ought to be able to do something with the water. I think they approached Metropolitan first. I know they did. And they were rebuffed, and then they went to San Diego. And I don't know that San Diego rebuffed them as much, but it turned out that they weren't able to do that. Only IID could. And they were trying to get IID to do it. And that was part of a whole sort of 3, 5, 7 year, just food fight over water in the Imperial Valley.
And the resolution of that, what was the end game?
That ended up being at least the building blocks of the QSA, because San Diego and IID did make a deal. I think they did it in 1998, and it took them another 4 or 5 years to cross the finish line with a QSA that Metropolitan would not oppose.
Were there additional discussions with San Diego when you were GM for?
Yeah, and during my time as GM, which was almost 8 years, we were also in a sort of transitional period on the river, and IID found itself, or I found myself, sort of trying to get IID back into a position where it was in the making friends business rather than, repelling people on the river, and we were largely successful in doing that, for some period of time. In fact, we did some joint binational water programs with Metropolitan during that time. And we had started out in a very sort of shaky place because we had IID had put water into the Salton Sea in 2010. When we were in litigation, we weren't sure if we would be able to keep going. We had conservation programs, we went forward, and rather than generating water to meet our Salton Sea obligations, we simply released water into the Salton Sea. And Metropolitan objected. Southern Nevada objected. I think the United Nations. And that water is still in dispute, and they capture it in a footnote in the decree counting every year. And I believe that they're talking about coming to some sort of an agreement on it.
Are we talking about a one-year release, or are we talking about multi-years?
No, just that 1 year. It ended up being about 45,000 acre feet, which IID had to during the first 15 years of those, excuse me, QSA water transfers, it was exclusively fallowing. And as you fallowed the ground on the farm, you had to generate an equivalent amount of water to make up for the lost runoff to the sea. So for the first 15 years, that was what was supposed to, sort of maintain stable salinity levels in the lake.
Wasn't there some state money involved in... my recollection is that the state agreed to pay any costs above and beyond a certain cost.
They did.
I'm a little foggy.
They did. So you'll remember, I think, that in 2002, IID tried to pass the QSA and failed by a vote of 3-2. A year later, they tried again in October of 2003, and they flipped the vote 3-2 in favor. And that started the water transfers. But the only way they got to a yes was that the state of California assumed a backstop on Salton Sea beyond the JPA commitment, JPA being the Joint Powers Authority of the three water agencies, IID, Coachella, San Diego, and then the state as the fourth JPA partner.
And hasn't there been an issue with the state living up to that?
Well, there's been a hell of an issue. And we did really well, I think, for a time, sort of as a IID, as a citizen of the river and in the making friends business. And then we filed a petition with the State Water Board to make that Salton Sea restoration / mitigation backstop real. And we asked the Water Board to go back to its water order authorizing the transfers and uphold that condition, what we saw as a condition of the transfers, which was that the Salton Sea would have a sustainable path, right? And we even conceded, it was a very important concession IID made. There are people who even today talk about, this expansive, big Salton Sea with imported water coming in from either Mexico or the Pacific Ocean, right? Well, we went right into the teeth of that, and we said, no, the Colorado River isn't going to support a lake that size in the future. IID can't be hamstrung from the conservation obligations we've already signed up for, let alone anything that comes in the future. And besides, we have this pledge, better than a pledge, we have this commitment from the state of California that it's going to make this right at the Salton Sea. And of course, we went through those 15 years, and nobody said, well, what about the Salton Sea? There were studies, there were meetings. I think they had a Restoration Act or a Restoration Council that was briefly impaneled, but nothing happened. So in 2015, IID filed that petition, and everybody freaked out because they didn't want the water turned off. And we weren't saying we were going to turn the water off. We were saying that, part and parcel of this deal was that the Salton Sea wasn't going to make people sick. So smaller is one thing, but it has to be on a sustainable path that people here can believe in. And not just the Imperial Valley, but Coachella Valley. Anywhere the wind blows, right? I don't know, as we sit here today, Jay, whether or not the Salton Sea ever becomes, this looming public health threat that we talk about or that we fear it might become. But I'll tell you, if you're on the IID board, if you're elected in this Imperial Valley, boy, you ought to be treating it like it could be. And now's the time to do it, because if we learned anything from the last decade, it is that we all have a part to play in complacency.
So how would you characterize I think that you're someone that has sort of the pulse of this area more so than most people. How do the citizens of the Imperial Valley feel about the Salton Sea? What's the let it go to hell, or we need to fix it, or?
I think that people are of two minds, and I think that it probably makes sense. This is a really big valley. It's spread out. It's not densely populated, but the Salton Sea is the biggest lake in California, and you couldn't ignore it if you wanted to. And we know, that just the hydrology is going to shrink the lake. It's happening already. And there won't be that mitigation water coming in to make it up. So absent some new water source, which is unlikely in this environment in which we live, the Salton Sea is going to get smaller. So what IID is saying is, you're looking, the river community, the West, you're looking to us to conserve water, and we want to conserve water, but you've put us between the devil and the Salton Sea, because every drop that we save isn't generating runoff to go into that lake. So you better help us as a river, as a community of aligned interests, and reckon with this problem, because it's a river problem, and it can't be solved just by the state of California, and certainly not by IID.
Did IID ever engage with Mexico informally or formally, but probably informally, with regard to the New River, which flows to the Salton Sea, but is not one of the rivers you want to be swimming in?
Well, so neither of those rivers that come into the Salton Sea, either the notorious New River or the Alamo, and they're both coming out of Mexico, right? But yeah, I've heard a lot more about the New River, especially in Calexico, and they're talking about encasing it as it comes across the border now, which, I'm all for, but it really doesn't, all it does is encase it for that portion of its journey to the Salton Sea.
Right, it's still contaminated.
Exactly.
water.
So it really needs to be tackled on the other side of the border, or even on this one. But something needs to be done about the makeup of the water.
And there's nothing being done about that?
Well, I don't know a lot about it, but I do know it's receiving a tremendous amount of attention from people who live near it in the community of Calexico. And it's starting to generate a lot of interest from the Imperial County Board of Supervisors, which has just sort of lived with it, right? As has IID. And IID, you're not going to be in a real hurry to go tackle water quality in those two rivers, right? But it is beyond ironic that we have not only this terrible river coming across the border into this state of California that we're a part of, that ends up in the Salton Sea, which is its own sort of, environmental question mark that nobody deals with because they figure that we'll just continue to put up with it. And I think that if water transfers are important, and they certainly are, then people really need to take a look at the environment here where the water's coming from. And if they can't, sort of commit to sort of open checkbook solution, and I understand why they can't, they need to be really honest with people and say, we're not going to create a ghetto in this place just because we think we can get away with it.
Well, I'll ask. Pardon me. I'll ask you to crystal ball that a little bit, maybe a little off track, but you've got the background to do a little fortune telling. What do you see as the future of the Salton Sea, given your background?
I think that the Salton Sea is going to be smaller, and I think that if it doesn't result in something better for the people who live here, and I mean all the people who live here, not just those conserving water for transfer, but the people who live in this valley, and Coachella Valley too, because in the end, I think this is a basic sort of environmental justice issue. But the Salton Sea needs to either have a combination of energy projects and environmental cover, mitigation projects, but it ought to result in something better, either a standard of living, certainly no diminution in the quality of the air, based on Salton Sea impacts. But I think that the Salton Sea, I've thought for a long time that the Salton Sea is a real, in addition to being the proving grounds of the QSA, I think it could be, a sort of incubator for this water energy nexus that people talk about, except it's a real place, and it just happens to contain the largest known geothermal resource, untapped, in this whole hemisphere, in a state that prides itself on leading the way in this new green economy. So,
one more question on the Salton Sea. Did the Water Authority, did IID, or does IID have a relationship with the Salton Sea Authority? That's a relatively new body. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, are they effective, or is it like, who are they? Or?
Yeah, so IID's a member of it, and it does go back to I think the mid-1990s. But it's a Riverside County, Imperial County body, mainly of elected officials. Imperial County is a member. IID's a member. The Torres Martinez tribe, which is right there on the northern section of the Salton Sea, is a member. Riverside County, Coachella Valley Water District. Yeah, I've heard some questions raised about the effectiveness of the Salton Sea Authority. I think that you have to have such an animal just to get everybody, at least in the same room, if not on the same page, especially at the Salton Sea. But there are problems because as a region, the Imperial Valley and the Coachella Valley are not in complete alignment on Salton Sea, I think. I think people are, but I think that maybe the two water agencies are not yet.
It might be useful for someone in the future that's viewing this to briefly talk about the hydraulics of of IID not conserving water and therefore allowing a great deal of drainage into the Salton Sea versus IID conserving water and thereby reducing the drainage. Maybe I answered my own question.
No, you did, and that's actually a really good. That people might actually be interested in that, and they wouldn't know. But as you know, IID got into the water transfer business because the state water board found that during a time of flooding, that the Salton Sea was getting too big. And so IID was told at that time, it's called Decision 1600. And that was the genesis for the Met 1 deal with IID.
This goes back to what came to be known as the Elmore.
That's it.
So,
Yeah, the latter part of the 1980s. And so the Met 1 deal, I think it's 106,000 acre feet. That paved the way for more, urban, ag to urban water transfers. And that was the jumping off point for the QSA talks. But the irony is what led to these charges, these allegations of waste here in the Imperial Valley was flooding at the Salton Sea. And what we're dealing with today is the opposite condition. It's not only not flooding, but it's disappearing.
Interesting to think about. I mean, it's there are no easy fixes, are there?
No.
Okay, let's go. During your tenure as GM, can you tell me a little bit about discussions and negotiations that went on with the Water Authority at that time? Because they're always looking for more water, and they're always looking for a certain degree of independence from MWD. And I think, if memory serves, they kind of looked at IID as one route toward that independence. What kinds of things were going on between those two agencies?
Well, it was funny because I found that instead of being buffeted by these larger urban agencies, we would go through here at IID during the drought, the state drought. We'd go through periods where we were, talking to Metropolitan about something. And we were talking to Metropolitan throughout the DCP talks for like 5 years, which San Diego was not a part of because it didn't hold a Section 5 contract, right? And San Diego deeply resented that. My friend there, Maureen Stapleton, who retired, she'd give me the fisheye about the DCP talks that they weren't a part of. And I'd tell her, oh, yeah, it's a shame. And I wish we could get you in there, but it's all those other people that are opposing you. And then I heard from her later that they had told her it was me keeping her out. So, but
well, now anyway, so what's the truth?
Yeah, so I had nothing to do on either side of it. I think it was a manifestation of that metropolitan San Diego friction, which I understand that they're trying to or they're at least trying to make some sort of a rapprochement.
Well, as a matter of fact, as we speak here today, on this date, there is a settlement agreement that's been offered from MWD to the Water Authority, and we won't go into it because we don't have the details. Like I say, it's just happening, and I think the Water Authority is even voting on it. They either did vote on it this week or they will vote on it next month. I'm not sure about that. Yeah. But it's a big deal.
No, it was I have seen it, and I expect that they'll vote it down. But it's I think that they're getting closer now. Maybe they're figuring out that going forward that they ought to quit shooting at each other.
Interesting. Lord, let me live in interesting times. Talk to me a little bit, or talk to us a little bit about your relationship with the other ag agencies here. I mean, PVID, and Palo Verde Irrigation District, and they always stand up and with the we're number one in terms of entitlement. The IID always stands up and says we're number big, because we have the biggest water entitlement.
Right.
And Coachella stands up and says, "Woe is us." I mean, that's sort of been there.
Well, no, they say we're friends with Metropolitan.
So what? Well, during your tenure, both as GM and even before that, how did IID get along with the other? I'll call them the other three.
This might actually be somewhat illuminating. I don't know. You decide, but Pat Mulroy, right?
Indeed.
Okay, so when I was first general manager, I think I was interim because there was some period of time where they were just, figuring out what they were going to do for real, right?
We should point out for the record that Pat Mulroy was the general manager of the Las Vegas Valley.
Oh yeah, long time.
District.
Yeah, a real force, and still continues to be. Yeah. Anyway, I only knew her by reputation, but I went to my first crew as general manager, and it was with a holdover board that was about to go into a really fraught election. So I was there with our attorney at the time, and I went to a meeting. I thought it was just an impromptu meeting. I thought I was going to have a beer, right? It turned out it was like, a standing meeting where they were going to confront IID about all of them together, the whole river, about this disputed water that we had put in the Salton Sea in 2010. I wasn't GM then, right? My predecessor, poor Brian Brady, got blamed for it. But anyway, they went around the horn. I can't remember exactly. There was some business. It was actually a standing meeting at the time, right? And but then they got around to talking about the Salton Sea and this water and why then they introduced Pat, and she looked right at me, didn't know me, and she said, "Why would you do that? Why would you put that? Why? That was what put us over. That was it. It was that 46,000 acre fee. Why would you do such a thing?" And I looked at her, and I looked at everybody, and I looked at IID's attorney, and I said, I'm going to have to talk to our attorney about this, get back to all of you at some point in the future.
Was that John Carter? Are we talking about?
No, it wasn't. It was David Osias.
Oh, David. Okay.
Yeah. But I played my attorney Bernie card, right? And anyway, I saw her after that, years later. We were in Denver for something. And she went back to that meeting and reminded me of how, feeble my answer had been. And also, how overrated the Salton Sea was as a problem, right? She wanted to just pave it over, make it the world's largest parking lot. And I said, "Yeah, Pat, but just think about it. We can only become good friends from here because we're starting at this terrible place, right?" And she had to find a laugh, and we've been friends ever since.
There was only room for improvement.
Exactly right.
And that was, by the way, just again for the record, that was at a meeting of the Colorado River Water Users Association in Las Vegas, which is an organization comprised of members from all the basin states and Mexico, as I recall. Okay, so we got Pat Mulroy. How do you get along with PVID? Is IID good with them, or
PVID? I think I don't know that we have any real. I don't know that we've ever had any real frosty relations with them. We have some farmers who we're so close,
Right.
But I mean, there is a fundamental difference in the makeup of the two organizations, the voting structure of the two.
Oh yeah, talk about that.
Yeah, so that at PVID, in addition to being on the river, right? So it's they get return flow credits and they're riparian, but they're also weighted voting. So it's if you have the most acres, you have the most votes, and this valley from its from the founding of the IID. It was one person, one vote. And I think that actually ended up being the difference between, a board that has as its mission a broad-based purpose, and one that might be a little more skewed to landowners.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. In PVID, a couple of large landowners with a lot of acreage could steer the district in a direction different than the largest number of people would want it steered. Whereas in IID, that can't happen because the large landowner doesn't have that much power.
Well, so if I know that there are a lot more agencies. It's not just PVID that does weighted voting. And I'm not saying that those are necessarily anti-democratic ways of doing it. I just think that this way is much better. It opens you up to, and IID is different anyway, because this is not only the nation's largest irrigation district, it's California's third largest public power provider. So it's an energy utility too. So it necessarily has to deliver the greatest good to the greatest number. And that tension on the water side, the greatest good for the greatest number. I don't know that I ever said that literally, but my critics during my time at IID, they would call me a socialist. And at the time, I wasn't even a Democrat. But I believed then, and I never really made it a part of the time I was GM. I made a conscious effort not to ever, there was no reason. We just come out of this period of litigation over the nature of the water rights, right? And there was no reason to bring it on, or to take it on. But because of the challenges on the Colorado River, we had those two big overruns in a row. And in 2013, we had to put in, for the first time ever, an apportionment. And we had to put people on, we had to pay back that water. And we were sued over it. And that lawsuit we're in an appellate court right now because the landowner, Mike Abadi, and all the farm groups that have filed amicus briefs in support of his position say that those water rights that IID acquired belong to them. IID's simply a pass-through. And they found a local judge to agree with them, and we're in the 4th District in San Diego appealing that decision.
Yeah, that was 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And IID's position, correct me if I'm wrong, IID's position has always been that it retains the water right?
Right, for its purposes. And those purposes are necessarily public because under California law, they couldn't be anything but that.
Okay. Since you mentioned power, I can't think of any other of the agencies, Colorado River agencies, other than MWD, which produces power only ancillarily, if that's a word. What is the source of IID's power? Where do you get it? Where do you distribute it?
Well, so the original portfolio of public power for IID was all hydro, and it was off of the All-American Canal. And it was aspirational because the canal wasn't built yet. So it was the 1930s. IID had a public vote and entered the public power business.
But you did
during the Depression.
Without any power.
Without any power. Now you could buy. So what ended up happening? There were private power companies both here and in Coachella Valley, and IID after that authorizing vote of the people over the next 10 years it acquired those two companies, but that was before the canal was built, and the canal has drops on it that generate about 40 megawatts of electricity.
Okay, and you purchased the rest of your domain?
Well, so that was many years ago. Electricity business was relatively new, but however energy was produced in those days, steam or gas or just building a fire. My point is that early in the 1930s, during the Depression, knowing that the canal was going to be built, and based on the same assumptions on Hoover Dam and the electrification that came from that, right? Because that legislation also included Imperial Dam and the All-American Canal. So electrification was part of the bundle.
But today,
so
2020.
one thing I can tell you about the energy side that I'm sure is still true is I think, unlike virtually any other electric utility in the state, public or private, all of IID's renewable energy resources, which every utility has to have in its portfolio, right? All of ours come right from the Imperial Valley. So geothermal, solar, some wind, mainly solar. But lots of the other all the other utilities purchase renewable energy from distant places.
Isn't there an anomaly where IID provides power northwest of here in the Coachella Valley, and those people don't get to vote, or something? I don't know a lot about that. I'm aware of it. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, this controversy we're going through right now with Pacific Gas and Electric and wildfires.
Okay, where they're shutting down power.
Well, where they don't. They're bankrupt, and people are saying, maybe we need a different model in California. So we have 3 investor-owned utilities. They serve, the majority of the state. And then you have all these little publics, IID being the third biggest, Sacramento and Los Angeles Department of Water and Power being 1 and 2. I think that as California continues to sort of grapple with this new reality of climate and the density of forests and overhead transmission lines, right? That there's going to have to be a reexamination of the role of a utility, and they're going to have to come up with something that looks a lot closer to the IID model, I think, where it's the rates are very low. And there's some sort of public buy-in to it, because these blackouts that I'm hearing about, and we don't have them here, but I don't see how a state is as big and successful as this one can keep going this way.
But how did that happen, that IID is providing power to this?
Well, it's a relic of those 2 private companies. In this valley, I think it was called Southern Sierra Power. And up there was another company, and IID acquired both of them. And it was invited it was actually anticipated in the compromise agreement between Coachella Valley Water District and IID in 1934. So IID was going to enter the power business. Coachella knew that. And in return for the concession of operating up there, Coachella received the 8% of IID's net power proceeds, which were to come off of the still-to-be-built All-American Canal. The All-American Canal was built. The compromise got Coachella on board with the construction of Hoover Dam and the All-American Canal, right? But those proceeds ended up being not just the All-American Canal, but 8% of everything IID ran through its portfolio for energy. So we ended up in court for several decades with Coachella, and Coachella won. So they get 8% of anything that we show at the end of the year as profit.
If you would, Kevin, just briefly describe, while you were general manager, your tenure as general manager, describe your relationship with MWD, and then I'm going to ask you about the Water Authority and Coachella. You know, not depthy, but you know, how do you guys get along?
So there was a real drawback to being too friendly with MWD while I was general manager.
Okay.
And I was always aware of that.
Which was?
You know, if you seem to be too chummy with, if I seem to be too chummy with Metropolitan, it could only mean that I was, you know, planning on selling IID out, right? Or if I spoke, you know, too favorably on something that, you know, they thought was trickier than that. But the thing about the Imperial Valley is, and I'll only say this, I have found that there's sort of a not an unjustified skepticism about people from big cities that come into the Imperial Valley to help with the water. And I'm not so impractical to believe that it's possible to maneuver through these coming years without being engaged in water matters on the Colorado River and without being a part of a solution to the challenging hydrology of the river for IID to fill that role. But I also recognized, and I think this will be true if people are honest about it going forward, that the best way for IID to successfully negotiate these uncertain times is with an urban partner in an arrangement that both sides can point to and say that they're protecting each other and that they're better off for doing it. And I think that if you match up in the case of Metropolitan, its resources and its political might, and then you take an agency like IID with this terrific resource that it has, that you know you can do good things together.
Did your relationship and ultimate transfers with the Water Authority damage your relationship with Met, or was it just kind of a neutral, non-issue kind of thing?
Well, early on, when I was general manager, we had a sea change here, and the board changed just in an election, and our direction changed, and we got out of the litigation that Metropolitan and San Diego, I think, are still in some fashion, or maybe not.
Well, it's a settlement that was.
But we were part of that, and we were on the side of San Diego. I guess we were on the side of San Diego. I wasn't really sure, but I went to the IID board, and I recommended that we get out, and I did that based on, well, number one, because I didn't think we were getting anything out of it. It looked to me like a religious war that, you know, anyway, we did get out, and we ended up doing a couple of deals with Metropolitan after that on the binational piece, the 2-minute orders.
Okay, so it sounds like IID was able to sort of walk down the middle of that road.
Tried to.
And how about Coachella? How's IID historically, in your history?
So, you know, I came into the job knowing the backstory with Coachella. You'll recall that when Tom Levy was there, that he used to dress up as Mulholland, and he had a lot of fun with the whole Bass Brothers escapade down here. But I think that Coachella is, in a lot of ways, I think that's a real success story. The way that it has evolved into a treated water system, and I mean, there's a lot to like about the Coachella system. It does tend to be opportunistic in terms of its relations with IID. I think that was in starkest relief when IID went to the State Water Board most recently on the Salton Sea. And Coachella just sort of reflexively sided with the urban water users, which it is one, and sort of, well, I would argue that they ignored the environmental problem that's right in their backyard, the Salton Sea. So they chose water. They chose water over public health, and it seemed to me it should have been a much more difficult decision for them than it was.
Okay, fair enough. Earlier, we talked with Ed Smith, and Ed apparently, since he retired, has been doing some consulting work with Bard Water District. I guess I would tell you that Bard Water District is probably the best kept secret in town, because they're really not a party to hardly anything that anyone talks to. I don't know that I've ever seen them at a Colorado River Board meeting. Or anywhere else for that matter. Does IID have?
Yeah, I know that guy there. I can't remember his name. He's going to kill me if he sees this. He's a really good guy, and you're right. Bard sort of flies under the radar because it's, it's there between Yuma and IID, right?
Yeah, and they have the number 2 priority.
They do, but it's a pretty small amount of water. And they have done some things with, I'm aware of some conservation programs they've done with Metropolitan.
Have they done anything with IID over time?
No.
Or
No.
You're just adjoining agencies?
Yeah. Yeah, and the scale is so much different.
Okay. Well, Kevin, we've covered a lot of ground here in the last hour. I'm going to jump next and see where you want to go with it. It's totally up to you. But you mentioned early on that you're working on a book, and you certainly have the background to be able to do that. But it's unwritten. I mean, you're not done yet. But tell us a little bit about it. Where are you going with it? Why are you writing a book?
Well, so it's certainly not the story of my life, because I plan for people to actually want to read it. But it will have to be the story of the Imperial Valley as seen by me. And I'm 60 years old now, but for college and some brief period of time spent away, I've always lived here. I have a younger brother who's a county supervisor, an elected person. My children are grown. I've always wanted to write a book, not necessarily this book, but how many people start out as an irrigator for his father and his uncle, irrigating out on just off the Highline Canal, kind of between pictures in college, debating what I would do next. I ended up stopping irrigating, went back to college. But in between, I had been a member of the Musicians Union. I'd played in bars. I'd cleaned pools. I'd done a lot of different things. I went back to college, and as soon as I got out, I got married, came back to the Imperial Valley, and I think, it seems to me, that for 35 years I've been fighting over water in this valley. Not as a public figure until the last decade. but I was in the midst of all of it. And I have this curse that I remember everything. People used to always ask me, they say, well, do you ever write any of this stuff down? I said, well, I'm afraid I'd forget if I ever tried to write it down. So now I'm testing myself. And I'd like to write a book about this very sort of misunderstood place that has all this water, and what it's done with it, maybe what it's failed to do with it. I think you could make an argument that we should have done a lot more. But now 120 years later, it's a different world than it was when the water came here. And I think it's going to be really important for IID to be thinking decades ahead as to where all this is going to end up, because IID will be part of that conversation, whether it's included or not. So it's a good idea to make sure it's included.
And do we have a dream schedule here in terms of?
I think it's as long as you're probably going to have to turn the camera off for me to answer you, but I think it's for as long as the laws hold up.
Okay. All right. Well, before we shut this off, what did I leave out?
No.
Would you like to talk about anything I've forgotten?
Not at all.
We're good?
Good.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you. Good to see you again.